The frozen water hit her skin like 1,000 knives as Harold's hands released their grip on her throat and shoved her backwards into Mineral Creek, the icy current immediately wrapping around her body and dragging her under the surface in the bitter January cold of 1885. Hannah Lawson's lungs seized as the shock of the water invaded every sense, her heavy wool dress becoming a sodden anchor that pulled her deeper into the churning darkness, while her husband's silhouette disappeared from the snowy bank above. She had known this day might come, had seen the rage building in his eyes for weeks now, ever since the mine foreman had dismissed him for drinking on the job, and he had blamed her for every misfortune that followed. The world above the water's surface seemed impossibly far away as her body tumbled in the current, her fingers grasping at nothing but liquid ice while her mind screamed for air that would not come. Nathan Quinn had been riding the trail along Mineral Creek on his way back to his small ranch outside Clifton when he saw the struggle on the bank, his chestnut mare already picking up speed before his mind fully registered what his eyes were seeing. A man stood at the water's edge, watching the dark shape beneath the surface with an expression that turned Nathan's blood cold even in the winter air. The cowboy didn't hesitate, swinging down from his saddle before his horse had fully stopped and running toward the creek with his boots pounding against the frozen ground. The man who had been watching spun around at the sound, his face twisted with something between guilt and defiance. But Nathan had no time for questions as he saw the woman's hand break the surface 10 yards downstream before disappearing again beneath the churning water. "What the hell did you do?" Nathan shouted as he ran past, but the other man was already backing away, stumbling in the snow as he turned and fled toward the cluster of buildings that made up the eastern edge of Clifton. Nathan reached the creek bank and dove without removing his coat or boots, the cold hitting him like a physical blow that drove the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp. The current grabbed him immediately, spinning him sideways as he fought to orient himself in the murky water, his eyes burning as he searched for any sign of the woman he had seen go under. His hand struck something soft and he grabbed blindly, his fingers closing around fabric that he pulled toward him with desperate strength. She was unconscious when he dragged her to the surface, her face pale as death beneath the wet strands of dark hair that clung to her cheeks. Nathan kicked hard for the bank, fighting the current that seemed determined to keep its prize, his arms burning with effort as he hauled her dead weight through the water. His boots finally found purchase on the rocky bottom, and he stood, lifting her in his arms and staggering up the snowy bank where his mare waited with her reins trailing on the ground. The woman wasn't breathing, and Nathan laid her on her side, pressing hard on her back until water poured from her mouth, and she convulsed with a choking gasp that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. But the danger was far from over as he felt the violent tremors that racked her body, her lips already turning blue in the frigid air. His ranch was 3 miles away and Clifton was closer, but something in his gut told him that the man who had done this might be waiting there, might come back to finish what he had started. Nathan made his decision in an instant, lifting Hannah back into his arms and mounting his horse with practiced ease, despite the awkward burden. He wrapped his coat around her soaking body and held her against his chest as he turned his mare north toward his property, urging the animal into a steady lope that ate up the distance while he prayed she would survive long enough to reach shelter. The ride seemed to take forever, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes before his small cabin came into view, smoke still rising from the chimney where he had banked the fire that morning. Nathan dismounted and carried the woman inside, kicking the door shut behind him and going straight to the fireplace, where he laid her on the braided rug and immediately began building up the flames. Her trembling had grown worse, and he knew he had to get the wet clothes off her body before hypothermia claimed what the creek had failed to take. His hands worked quickly but respectfully, unlacing her sodden boots and pulling them off along with her stockings, then unbuttoning the heavy dress that clung to her skin like a second layer of ice. He averted his eyes as much as possible while removing the wet garments, leaving only her thin chemise for modesty's sake, before wrapping her in every blanket he owned and pulling her close to the fire. But even that was not enough as the violent shaking continued, and Nathan knew from his years working cattle in harsh winters that she needed more warmth than blankets and fire could provide alone. He pulled off his own wet boots and shirt, his skin still cold from the creek, and wrapped himself around her trembling form, sharing what heat his body could generate while he rubbed her arms and back to stimulate circulation. "Come on," he murmured against her wet hair. "You are going to be all right. Stay with me now." He had no idea if she could hear him, but he kept talking anyway, his voice low and steady as he held her against his chest and willed his warmth into her frozen body. Minutes passed like hours while he monitored her breathing, relieved to feel it growing steadier even as the tremors slowly began to subside. Her face was still pale but no longer had that terrifying gray cast, and when he pressed his fingers to her throat, her pulse beat strong and regular beneath his touch. Hannah surfaced to consciousness slowly, emerging from darkness into confused awareness of warmth and safety that made no sense given her last coherent memory of drowning in freezing water. Her body ached in every muscle and her throat burned when she tried to swallow, but she was alive and warm and wrapped in strong arms that held her like something precious rather than something to be discarded. She opened her eyes to find herself in an unfamiliar cabin, lying in front of a roaring fire while a man she had never seen before held her against his bare chest with her head tucked beneath his chin. She jerked in surprise and he immediately loosened his hold, his hands raising in a gesture of peace as he shifted back to give her space. "Easy now," he said quietly, his voice rough with concern. "You are safe here. I pulled you out of the creek." His eyes were kind despite the worry in them, a warm brown that reminded her of honey in sunlight, and his face bore the weathered tan of someone who spent his life outdoors. He looked to be perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly when wet, and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. Memory flooded back in a rush that made Hannah's breath catch in her throat. Harold's hands around her neck, the crushing cold of the water, the certainty that she was going to die. She raised shaking fingers to her throat and felt the tender bruises already forming there, evidence of how close she had come to never taking another breath. "He tried to kill me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "My husband threw me in the creek." Nathan felt rage kindle in his chest at the confirmation of what he had suspected, but he kept his voice gentle as he met her eyes. "I know. I saw him." He reached slowly for another blanket and draped it around her shoulders, careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten her. "He ran off when I went in after you. My name is Nathan Quinn. This is my ranch about 3 miles north of Clifton." "Hannah," she managed, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as she became aware of her state of undress. "Hannah Lawson." She saw her wet dress hanging over a chair near the fire, and understood that this stranger had undressed her out of necessity, rather than impropriety, had saved her life not once but twice by pulling her from the creek, and then warming her frozen body with his own. The realization brought tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the kindness of a man she did not know compared to the cruelty of the man she had married. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking on the words. If you had not been there, if you had not come when you did. She could not finish the sentence because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Nathan shook his head firmly, moving to stoke the fire and give her privacy to collect herself. You do not need to thank me for doing what any decent person would have done. What you need is dry clothes and something hot to drink. He stood and walked to a trunk against the far wall, pulling out a flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers that would be far too large for her, but would at least be warm and dry. He set them on the chair next to her dress and turned his back. I will give you privacy to change. There is a screen in the corner if you can stand. Hannah's legs felt weak as water when she tried to rise, but she managed to get behind the wooden screen, peeling off the damp chemise and pulling on the borrowed clothes that hung on her small frame like a child playing dress-up in adult garments. But they were warm and soft and smelled faintly of wood smoke and soap, and she had never been more grateful for simple comforts in her 23 years of life. When she emerged from behind the screen, Nathan had pulled on a dry shirt and was hanging a kettle over the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. He glanced at her, and she saw his mouth quirk slightly at the sight of her drowning in his clothes, but his eyes remained serious as he gestured to the chair closest to the fire. Sit down before you fall down. You have been through hell today. Hannah sank gratefully into the chair, tucking her bare feet beneath her and watching as he prepared tea with the ease of someone long accustomed to caring for himself. I need to know what happened, Nathan said as he handed her a steaming tin cup. Not to pry into your business, but because that man is still out there, and I need to know if he is going to come looking for you. Hannah wrapped her cold fingers around the cup and stared into the dark liquid, gathering her thoughts and her courage. It shamed her to speak of what her marriage had become, to admit that she had endured Harold's rages and his fists for the better part of 2 years, but this man had saved her life and deserved the truth. His name is Harold Lawson, she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. We married in Texas 3 years ago. He was different then, or maybe I just did not see what he truly was. We came to Arizona last year when he heard the copper mines were hiring. Things were all right for a while, but he started drinking, spending his wages in the saloons instead of bringing them home. When he lost his position at the mine last month, he blamed me, said I was a burden around his neck. She paused to sip the tea, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. It got worse after that. He would come home drunk and angry, and his anger always needed somewhere to go. She unconsciously touched her throat again, and Nathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her tell the story at her own pace. Today he accused me of being unfaithful, said that was why he had lost his job, because everyone in town was laughing at him behind his back. Nothing I said made any difference. He just kept hitting me until I could barely stand, and then he dragged me to the creek end. Her voice failed and she could not continue. Nathan set down his own cup and knelt beside her chair, his hand hovering near hers before settling gently over her trembling fingers. He is not going to hurt you again, he said with quiet conviction. You are safe here, and I will make sure you stay safe. Hannah looked into his eyes and saw that he meant every word, saw a steadiness and strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with the character of the man himself. She had known him less than an hour, but already she trusted him more than she had ever trusted her own husband. I cannot go back to town, she said, fear creeping into her voice. He will find me there. He will finish what he started. Nathan squeezed her hand gently and then stood, moving to the window to look out at the fading afternoon light. Then you will stay here until we figure out what to do. I have a spare room you can use. He turned back to face her with determination written across his features. Tomorrow I will ride into Clifton and speak to Sheriff Morrison. What your husband did is attempted murder, and he needs to answer for it." Hannah wanted to believe it would be that simple, but she had lived long enough in rough mining towns to know that the law often looked the other way when it came to what a man did to his wife. "Harold has friends in town," she said quietly. "Men who drink with him and think the same way he does. The sheriff might not be willing to arrest him based on my word against his." Nathan's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of what she said. "Then we will be careful about how we handle this. But Hannah, you cannot live in fear of that man for the rest of your life. Something has to be done." She knew he was right even as the thought terrified her. For now, though, she was too exhausted to think about tomorrow's problems when she was still recovering from today's near death. Nathan seemed to sense her fatigue because he helped her to her feet and guided her to the small bedroom off the main room, a simple space with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt and a table holding a wash basin and pitcher. "Rest," he said from the doorway. "You are safe here, and I will be right outside if you need anything." Hannah lay down on the bed without bothering to pull back the quilt, her body sinking into the soft mattress as exhaustion rolled over her in waves. She heard Nathan close the door quietly, and then his footsteps moving away, the soft sounds of him tending the fire and moving about the cabin oddly comforting in their normalcy. Despite everything that had happened, despite the fear and pain and trauma of the day, she felt her eyes growing heavy as her body demanded the rest it needed to heal. She slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months, wrapped in borrowed clothes and the knowledge that for tonight at least, she was safe. Nathan stood watch through the long winter night, stoking the fire and listening for any sound that might indicate danger approaching. His rifle rested within easy reach against the wall, and his revolver hung from the chair beside him. Insurance against the possibility that Harold Lawson might discover where his wife had gone and come to finish his murderous work. But the hours passed quietly, with nothing more threatening than the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance, and the whisper of wind through the pines that surrounded his property. He found himself thinking about the woman sleeping in his spare room, wondering what circumstances had led her to marry a man like Harold Lawson, wondering what her life had been before fear and pain had become her daily companions. She was beautiful despite the bruises that marked her pale skin, with delicate features and dark hair that would fall past her shoulders when dry. But it was the strength he had seen in her eyes that stayed with him through the long night. She had survived something that would have broken a weaker person, and she was still fighting to live despite everything that had been done to her. Morning came cold and clear, the winter sun rising over the mountains to the east and painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Nathan made coffee and started breakfast, the smell of bacon frying eventually bringing Hannah to the door of her room with her borrowed clothes rumpled from sleep, and her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked better than she had the night before, with color in her cheeks and steadiness in her movements that suggested her body was recovering even if her spirit would take longer to heal. "Good morning," Nathan said, pulling out a chair for her at the small table. "How are you feeling?" Hannah sat slowly, testing her body's response to the question before answering. "Sore," she admitted, "and my throat hurts, but alive, thanks to you." She accepted the plate he offered her and ate with surprising appetite, the ordeal of the previous day having left her hollow with hunger. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Nathan spoke again, his tone careful as he broached the subject they both knew had to be addressed. "I meant what I said last night about talking to the sheriff, but I think we need to be smart about how we approach this." He set down his fork and met her eyes across the table. Harold knows I pulled you out of the creek. He saw me before he ran. He is going to be wondering if you survived, and if you did, whether you are going to tell anyone what he did. That makes him dangerous not just to you, but potentially to himself. Hannah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and considered his words. What are you suggesting? Nathan leaned back in his chair, thinking through the plan that had been forming in his mind during the long night. I think we should go to the sheriff together and tell him exactly what happened. But first I want to stop by Doc Wilson's office and have him examine you, document your injuries. That way it is not just your word against Harold's. We will have evidence. The thought of returning to Clifton, of potentially encountering her husband, made Hannah's stomach clench with fear, but she knew Nathan was right. She could not hide forever, and Harold would not simply disappear just because she wished it. All right, she said quietly. When do we go? Nathan studied her face for a moment, seeing the fear but also the determination, and felt his respect for her grow. This afternoon. That will give you more time to recover your strength and give me time to make sure we will be safe. They spent the rest of the morning in quiet domesticity that felt surreal given the circumstances that had brought them together. Nathan showed Hannah around the small ranch, introducing her to his 3 horses and handful of cattle that were his livelihood. She helped him feed the animals despite his protests that she should rest, needing to feel useful and normal after the nightmare of the previous day. He spoke about his life with easy openness, telling her how he had come west 5 years ago from Missouri after his father died, seeking a fresh start and a place to build something of his own. It is not much, he said as they stood in the barn doorway looking out at the snow-covered pasture, but it is mine, and I have made it work through hard seasons and good ones. I run cattle mostly, sell them to the mining camps for beef. It is honest work, and it lets me live the way I want to live. Hannah heard the pride in his voice and felt a pang of envy for his freedom, for the life he had built on his own terms. She had never known that kind of independence, had gone from her father's house to her husband's with no say in her own destiny. It sounds like a good life, she said softly. Nathan glanced at her and saw the wistfulness in her expression, understanding more than she said in those simple words. It can be lonely sometimes, he admitted, but I would rather be alone than living a lie or staying somewhere I am not wanted. He paused and then added carefully, you could have that too, you know, a fresh start, a life of your own choosing. Hannah looked up at him, surprised by the suggestion. How? I have no money and no family here. Everything I own is back in the house I shared with Harold, and even if I could get it, it would not be enough to start over somewhere new. Nathan turned to face her fully, his expression serious. There are ways. Once we deal with Harold and make sure he cannot hurt you again, we can figure out the rest. You could find work in Clifton or one of the other towns. Or, he hesitated, not wanting to overstep but feeling compelled to offer anyway. Or you could stay here for a while, just until you get back on your feet. I could use help with the ranch and you would be safe. The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and generous in equal measure. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes at his kindness, at the fact that this stranger was willing to help her when he owed her nothing and had already done more than anyone had a right to expect. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do this for me? You do not even know me. Nathan met her gaze steadily, his brown eyes warm and honest. Because it is the right thing to do, because you deserve better than what you have gotten from life so far, and because... He paused, searching for the right words. Because from the moment I pulled you out of that creek, I knew I could not just walk away and leave you to face this alone. Maybe that makes me a fool, but I have never been very good at minding my own business when someone needs help. Hannah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun and everything to do with the man standing before her. She had been so certain that all men were like Harold, that cruelty and selfishness were simply part of their nature, but Nathan was proving her wrong with every word and deed. "Thank you," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "For everything. I accept your offer, at least for now, until I can figure out what comes next." Nathan smiled, the expression transforming his serious face into something that made Hannah's breath catch unexpectedly. "Good. Now let us get ready to go into town. The sooner we deal with this, the sooner you can start moving forward." They returned to the cabin, and Nathan helped Hannah into his spare coat, the garment almost comically large on her small frame but warm and well made. He checked his revolver and strapped on his gun belt, the weight of the weapon a familiar comfort as he prepared to face whatever waited for them in Clifton. The ride into town took less than an hour with Hannah riding behind Nathan on his mare, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance as they navigated the snowy trail. She tried not to think about how solid and warm he felt, tried not to notice how safe she felt pressed against his back, but her traitorous mind kept returning to those observations, despite her best efforts to focus on the ordeal ahead. They entered Clifton from the north, riding slowly down the main street past the assay office and general store, until they reached the modest building that served as both doctor's office and the closest thing the mining town had to a hospital. Doc Wilson was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and gentle hands, who had seen more than his share of injuries in a town where mine accidents and bar fights were common occurrences. He listened gravely as Nathan explained what had happened, his expression growing darker as he examined the bruises on Hannah's throat and the marks on her arms where Harold's fingers had dug into her flesh. "This is attempted murder," he said bluntly, as he made careful notes in his record book. "No question about it. The sheriff needs to know about this immediately." Nathan helped Hannah down from the examination table, and they made their way across the street to the sheriff's office, a small structure with barred windows and a sign hanging above the door. Sheriff John Morrison was a large man with a gray mustache and a reputation for fairness that had served him well in a town full of rough miners and rougher prospectors. He listened without interrupting as Nathan and Hannah told their story, his expression growing increasingly grim as the tale unfolded. "Harold Lawson," the sheriff said when they finished, leaning back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "I know the man. He has been in here a few times for drunk and disorderly, but nothing like this." He looked at Hannah with sympathy clear in his weathered face. "Madam, I believe you and I will do everything in my power to see that justice is served, but I have to be honest with you about how this is likely to go. We will arrest him and hold him for trial, but convincing a jury to convict a man for what he did to his wife is going to be difficult. There are men in this town who think a husband has the right to discipline his wife however he sees fit." Hannah felt her heart sink even though she had expected nothing different. Nathan, however, straightened in his chair with steel in his voice. "Then we will find 12 men with enough sense and decency to know that attempted murder is a crime regardless of who the victim is. Doc Wilson has documented her injuries. I witnessed Harold standing on that creek bank watching her drown. We have everything we need for a conviction if we can find honest men to sit on that jury." Sheriff Morrison studied Nathan for a long moment and then nodded slowly. "You are right. Let me go find Harold and bring him in. You two stay here where I know you are safe." He stood and reached for his hat, checking his sidearm before heading toward the door. "Do you know where he is likely to be?" Nathan asked. The sheriff snorted. "If he follows his usual pattern, he is probably at the Silver Dollar drinking away whatever money he has left. I will start there." After the sheriff left, Nathan and Hannah sat in the small office with tension coiling tighter with each passing minute. Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap, fear and anticipation warring within her as she waited to learn if the man who had tried to kill her would finally face consequences for his actions. Nathan reached over and covered her hands with one of his own, his touch warm and reassuring. "It is going to be all right," he said quietly. "Morrison is a good man and he will do his job." They waited nearly an hour before the sheriff returned with Harold in handcuffs, the smaller man stumbling slightly as he was pushed through the door. Hannah shrank back in her chair at the sight of her husband, all the old fear rising up to choke her. But Nathan stood and positioned himself between them, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was both protective and warning. Harold's eyes found Hannah and something ugly twisted in his expression. "You lying bitch," he snarled, lunging toward her despite the restraints. "I should have held you under longer." Sheriff Morrison yanked him back with enough force to make Harold grunt in pain, shoving him toward the cell in the back of the office. "That is enough of that. You just made my job a whole lot easier with that confession." He locked Harold in the cell and returned to his desk, writing up formal charges while Harold shouted obscenities from behind the bars. "I am going to send a wire to the territorial judge," Morrison told Nathan and Hannah once Harold had exhausted himself and fallen into sullen silence. "Trial will probably be in a few weeks. In the meantime, madam, I suggest you find somewhere safe to stay. Even with him locked up, he has friends who might not take kindly to his arrest." Nathan spoke before Hannah could respond. "She is staying at my ranch. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The sheriff raised an eyebrow but nodded his approval. "That is probably for the best. I will send word when the trial date is set." They left the office with Hannah feeling like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, even as another settled in its place. Harold was in custody, but the trial still loomed ahead, and she would have to face him again and recount the worst moments of her life for an audience of strangers who might or might not believe her. Nathan seemed to sense her turmoil because he helped her mount the horse and swung up behind her this time, his arms bracketing her body as he took the reins and turned them toward home. "You were very brave today," he said as they rode out of town. Hannah leaned back against his chest without thinking, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I do not feel brave. I feel terrified." Nathan's arms tightened slightly around her, the gesture protective rather than confining. "Bravery is not about not being afraid. It is about doing what needs to be done even when you are scared to death. That is what you did today." They rode in silence for a while, the winter landscape passing slowly around them as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Hannah found herself thinking about the weeks ahead, about what it would mean to stay at Nathan's ranch and build some kind of temporary life there while they waited for the trial. She barely knew this man who had saved her life, yet she trusted him in a way she had never trusted anyone before. There was a goodness in him that shone through every action, a fundamental decency that had nothing to do with seeking reward or recognition, and everything to do with simply being who he was. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. Nathan made an encouraging sound and she continued, "Why are you not married? A man like you with land and a good character, surely there have been women who caught your attention." She felt him shrug slightly behind her. "I came close once, back in Missouri. Her name was Sarah, and I thought we would build a life together. But when my father died and I decided to come west, she was not willing to leave her family and everything she knew. We parted on good terms, but it made me realize that I needed someone who wanted the same things I did, someone willing to take chances and build something new. Hannah absorbed this information, understanding the loneliness behind his words. "Have you found that person out here?" Nathan was quiet for a moment before answering. "No. I have met a few women over the years, but no one who felt right. The kind of woman I am looking for is not easy to find. She would need to be strong and independent, someone who could handle the isolation and hard work of ranch life. Someone who wanted partnership rather than just security." He paused and then added with a note of self-deprecating humor, "I suppose I am too particular for my own good." Hannah smiled despite herself, thinking that being particular about choosing a life partner seemed like wisdom rather than pickiness given her own disastrous marriage. "I think you are right to wait for the right person. A bad marriage is worse than no marriage at all." Nathan heard the pain in her voice and wished he could erase the memories that caused it. "What about you?" he asked gently. "What did you want from life before Harold?" The question caught Hannah off guard because no one had asked her what she wanted in longer than she could remember. "I wanted a home," she said slowly, piecing together dreams she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten they existed. Not just a house, but a real home, the kind filled with laughter and safety. "I wanted children someday, and maybe a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers." Simple things, really, but things that felt impossible once I understood what my marriage actually was. "Those are not simple things," Nathan said firmly. "Those are the things that make life worth living, and they are not impossible, Hannah. Maybe they feel that way right now, but you are only 23 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you still." Hannah wanted to believe him, but years of living with Harold had taught her that hope was dangerous, that wanting things only led to disappointment and pain. Still, sitting here in Nathan's arms as they rode through the golden afternoon light, she felt the tiniest spark of possibility begin to glow in her chest. They reached the ranch as evening was falling, the cabin windows glowing with welcoming warmth from the fire Nathan had banked that morning. He helped Hannah down from the horse and saw to the animal's care before they went inside, the familiar routine somehow comforting after the tension of the day. Hannah moved around the small kitchen with growing confidence, helping Nathan prepare a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, while they talked about inconsequential things that helped ease the weight of everything that had happened. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged as they waited for news of the trial. Nathan taught Hannah how to care for the horses and cattle, showing her the daily rhythms of ranch life with patient instruction that never made her feel inadequate or foolish. She proved to be a quick learner with a natural affinity for the animals, and Nathan found himself looking forward to their morning chores when they would work side by side in comfortable silence or easy conversation. Hannah blossomed in the safety and peace of the ranch, her bruises fading to yellow and then disappearing entirely as her body healed. But more than that, Nathan watched as she slowly began to reclaim pieces of herself that Harold had tried to destroy. She smiled more easily, laughed at Nathan's dry humor, asked questions about everything from cattle breeding to the names of the mountains visible from the pasture. She was curious and intelligent and surprisingly funny, once she felt safe enough to let her personality emerge from behind the walls she had built for protection. Nathan found himself drawn to her in ways that both excited and terrified him. He had not lied when he told her he was particular about the kind of woman he wanted, but Hannah exceeded even his specific requirements in ways he had never anticipated. She was strong but not hardened, gentle but not weak, and she possessed a resilience that left him in awe. He caught himself watching her as she moved around the cabin or worked in the barn, admiring the way afternoon light caught in her dark hair or the concentration on her face as she learned to repair a bridle. But he was also acutely aware that she was still healing from trauma that ran deeper than physical bruises, that she was in no position to be making decisions about her future while her past still had its claws in her. So Nathan kept his growing feelings to himself and focused on being her friend and protector, giving her the space and time she needed to find her footing again. Still, there were moments when their eyes would meet across the dinner table or their hands would brush while working together, and Nathan would see something in her expression that made his heart race with hope. One evening about 3 weeks after Hannah had come to the ranch, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains in spectacular shades of orange and purple. It was unusually warm for February, and they had brought their coffee outside to enjoy the mild weather, sitting in companionable silence while the world grew dark around them. Hannah spoke suddenly, her voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. "I have been thinking about what comes after the trial, about what I want to do with my life." Nathan turned to look at her, seeing determination in the set of her jaw. "What have you decided?" Hannah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and chose her words carefully. "I want to file for divorce from Harold. Even if he goes to prison, I do not want to be legally bound to him for the rest of my life. And then I want to start over somewhere new, somewhere he cannot find me if he ever gets out." She paused and then added quietly, "I know I said I would only stay here until I got back on my feet, but if your offer is still open, I would like to stay longer. I want to learn everything you can teach me about ranching. I think maybe that could be my future, working with horses and cattle instead of being dependent on a husband for survival." Nathan felt his chest tighten with emotions he could not fully name. "The offer is absolutely still open. You can stay as long as you want, Hannah. And I will teach you everything I know." He hesitated and then added, "But I want you to know that you are not just hired help to me. You are my friend and I care about what happens to you." Hannah turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his in the dim light. "You are my friend too, Nathan. The best friend I have ever had, actually. I do not know what I would have done without you these past few weeks." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Then Hannah smiled and the tension eased, settling into something warm and promising. "Tell me more about what you want to do with this ranch," she said. "What are your dreams for this place?" Nathan leaned back in his chair and let himself imagine out loud, describing his plans to expand the herd. Maybe get some chickens and plant a larger garden come spring. Build a proper barn to replace the small structure that barely held his 3 horses. Hannah listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering suggestions that showed she had been paying attention to everything he had taught her. They talked until the stars came out in full force, their conversation ranging from practical matters to philosophical musings about what made a good life. When they finally went inside, Nathan felt lighter than he had in years, as if sharing his dreams with someone who actually cared had made them more real and attainable. The news they had been waiting for arrived in early March when Sheriff Morrison rode out to the ranch with word that Harold's trial had been scheduled for the end of the month. "The judge is coming down from Prescott," the sheriff explained as he accepted the coffee Nathan offered. "He has a reputation for being fair but tough. I think we have a good chance of conviction given the evidence and your testimony, madam." Hannah nodded, trying to quell the anxiety that rose at the thought of facing Harold again. "What kind of sentence is he looking at if convicted?" Nathan asked. Morrison's expression was grim. Attempted murder could mean anywhere from 10 to 20 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. Of course, that assumes the jury actually convicts him. He looked at Hannah with concern. "I want to prepare you for the possibility that they might not, madam. Like I said before, There are men who do not think what happens between a husband and wife is any of the law's business. Hannah lifted her chin with a determination that made Nathan proud. Then I will just have to make sure they understand that what Harold did was not discipline or even abuse, but attempted murder. I will tell them everything and pray that 12 men can be found with enough decency to see the truth. Sheriff Morrison smiled slightly at her fierce tone. That is the spirit. The prosecutor is a good man named William Thornton. He will meet with you before the trial to prepare your testimony. After the sheriff left, Hannah paced the cabin with nervous energy that would not be contained. Nathan watched for a few minutes and then stood, catching her hand as she passed and pulling her to a stop. "Talk to me," he said gently. "What is going through your head right now?" Hannah looked up at him and he saw fear and anger warring in her green eyes. "I am terrified that the jury will not believe me, that Harold will go free and come after me again. But I am also angry, angrier than I have ever been, because he took so much from me, and now I have to stand up in front of strangers and expose all my shame and pain just to maybe see justice done." Nathan pulled her into his arms without thinking, holding her while she trembled with the force of her emotions. "Your shame," he repeated, his voice incredulous. "Hannah, you have nothing to be ashamed of." "Harold is the one who should be ashamed, who should be crawling on his belly and begging forgiveness for what he did to you. You survived something horrific and came out the other side still fighting. That is not shameful, that is extraordinary." Hannah pressed her face against his chest and let herself draw strength from his words and his solid presence. Nathan's arms around her felt like safety and home in a way she had never experienced before, and when she finally pulled back to look at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. He was looking at her the way she had caught herself looking at him lately, with warmth and affection and something deeper that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge until now. "Nathan," she whispered, not sure what she was asking but hoping he understood anyway. He raised one hand to cup her cheek, his calloused palm rough and gentle at the same time. "I know the timing is terrible," he said quietly, "and I know you have been through hell and probably need time before you are ready for anything like this. But I have to tell you, Hannah, these past weeks with you here have been the happiest I can remember. You have become so important to me, and I do not want you to leave when the trial is over." Hannah felt tears sting her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I do not want to leave either," she admitted. "Being here with you has shown me what life could be like, what it should be like. You make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I never was before." She paused and then added with absolute honesty, "I think I am falling in love with you, Nathan Quinn, and that terrifies me almost as much as the trial does." Nathan's face lit up with a smile that transformed him into someone even more handsome than he already was. "Good," he said firmly. "Because I am absolutely falling in love with you, Hannah Lawson, and I plan to do everything in my power to show you what it feels like to be loved the right way." He bent slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was tender and sweet and full of promise. Hannah melted into the kiss, her arms sliding around his neck as she let herself feel the full weight of her emotions for the first time. This was what it was supposed to be like, she realized with stunning clarity. This gentleness and respect and genuine affection. This was what she had dreamed of as a young girl before Harold had taught her that love was just another word for ownership. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, their foreheads resting together while they processed what had just happened between them. "We should probably talk about this," Nathan said reluctantly, though his arms remained firmly around her waist. "About what it means and where we go from here." Hannah nodded, letting him lead her to the sofa where they sat close together, their hands intertwined. "I want to be with you," she said simply. "But I need to deal with Harold first, need to get the divorce and close that chapter of my life before I can really start a new one. Can you be patient with me?" Nathan brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I can be as patient as you need me to be. We will take this at whatever pace feels right for you. There is no rush, Hannah. I am not going anywhere." They talked long into the night, sharing hopes and fears and dreams for the future with an openness that felt natural despite how recently they had met. Hannah told Nathan about her childhood in Texas, about the parents she had lost to fever when she was 19, about how alone she had felt when Harold had seemed like her only option for survival. Nathan told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about his younger sister who had married a merchant and still wrote to him regularly, about the wanderlust that had driven him west and the satisfaction he had found in building something with his own two hands. They learned each other's stories, and in the telling found that their separate paths had been leading them toward this moment, toward each other. By the time they finally went to their separate rooms in the early morning hours, Hannah felt like she understood Nathan in ways that went beyond the surface, and she knew he understood her just as deeply. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and contentment. Nathan and Hannah continued their daily routine of ranch work, but now there was an added dimension to their relationship, a romance that grew stronger with each passing day. Nathan courted her properly despite their living situation, bringing her wildflowers he found in the pasture and teaching her to dance in the cabin with only the crackling fire for music. Hannah learned to trust his touch and his kisses, discovering that physical affection could be a source of joy rather than pain. They were careful to maintain propriety despite their feelings, with Hannah continuing to sleep in the spare room, and Nathan never pressing for more than she was ready to give. But there were moments of stolen kisses and lingering embraces that left them both breathless and wanting more, that made Hannah look forward to a future when she would be free to love Nathan without the shadow of her marriage hanging over them. The day of the trial arrived with gray clouds threatening rain, the weather seeming to mirror the gravity of what lay ahead. Nathan and Hannah rode into Clifton together, her hand gripping his tightly as they approached the courthouse that had been converted from an old saloon for the occasion. People gathered outside in small clusters, miners and merchants and their families drawn by the drama of a man being tried for attempting to murder his wife. Hannah felt their eyes on her as she dismounted and smoothed her borrowed dress, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her progress up the steps. Prosecutor William Thornton met them inside, a serious man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for thoroughness. He had spent an hour with Hannah the previous week preparing her testimony, and he nodded approvingly now as he saw her composure. "Remember," he said quietly, "just tell the truth exactly as it happened. Look at the jury when you speak, and do not let Harold's lawyer intimidate you. You have every right to be heard." The courtroom filled quickly, and Hannah found herself sitting at the front beside Nathan, acutely aware of Harold sitting 20 feet away at the defense table. Her husband looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by weeks in jail and the suit his attorney had dressed him in for the trial. But when his eyes met hers across the room, she saw the same rage and hatred that had been there the day he threw her in the creek, and she knew that given the chance he would finish what he had started. Judge Marcus Randolph was an imposing figure with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded immediate respect. He called the court to order, and the trial began with opening statements from both attorneys. Thornton laid out the case methodically, describing how Harold had beaten Hannah and then attempted to drown her in Mineral Creek, only to be thwarted by Nathan's intervention. Harold's attorney, a slick-looking man named Davies, argued that this was a domestic dispute that had gotten out of hand, that Harold had been drunk and not in his right mind, and that Hannah had provoked him with her nagging and disrespect. Hannah felt rage burn in her chest at the audacity of Davies' argument, but Nathan's hand found hers beneath the table and squeezed reassuringly. She was called to the stand first and made her way to the witness box on legs that felt steadier than she expected. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat and faced the room full of strangers who would decide her husband's fate. Thornton led her through her testimony with gentle professionalism, asking her to describe her marriage and the escalating abuse that had culminated in Harold's attempt on her life. Hannah spoke clearly and directly, not sparing any of the brutal details, but also not dramatizing them. She described the beating and how Harold had dragged her to the creek, how he had held her underwater before throwing her into the current and watching her drown. She looked at the jury as she spoke and saw a range of reactions from sympathy to discomfort to outright skepticism. When Davies cross-examined her, he tried to make her seem like an unreliable witness, suggesting she was exaggerating or misremembering events, implying that she had been unfaithful to Harold and driven him to violence. Hannah refused to be cowed, answering each question with calm honesty and meeting Davies' attempts at intimidation with quiet dignity. "Did you love your husband?" Davies asked at one point, as if that mattered. Hannah looked him straight in the eye and said, "I tried to love him." But it is impossible to love someone who uses his fists to solve every problem and who ultimately tried to kill you. Nathan testified next, describing what he had witnessed on the creek bank and his rescue of Hannah from the freezing water. His testimony was clear and unshakable, and when Davies tried to suggest that Nathan might have ulterior motives for helping Hannah, Nathan's response was cutting. "My motive was preventing a murder. If that is somehow suspicious to you, I would suggest examining your own conscience." The courtroom rippled with murmurs at that, and Judge Randolph had to call for order. Doc Wilson's testimony provided medical evidence of Hannah's injuries, and several townspeople testified to Harold's drinking and violent temper. The defense called character witnesses who claimed Harold was a good man when sober, but their testimony rang hollow against the weight of evidence presented by the prosecution. Harold himself chose not to testify, perhaps sensing that his own words would only damage his case further. The trial lasted 2 full days before both sides rested, and Judge Randolph sent the jury to deliberate. Hannah and Nathan waited in the courtroom while the 12 men argued in the back room, the minutes crawling past with agonizing slowness. 3 hours passed before the jury filed back in, their faces grave and impossible to read. Hannah's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant Harold Lawson guilty of attempted murder," the foreman announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Hannah felt her knees go weak with relief, and Nathan's arm came around her shoulders, holding her upright as the implications sank in. Harold shouted something obscene from the defense table and had to be restrained by the bailiff while Judge Randolph banged his gavel for order. When the room quieted, the judge fixed Harold with a stern look. "Harold Lawson, you have been found guilty of attempting to murder your wife in a crime of cowardly brutality. This court sentences you to 20 years hard labor at the territorial prison in Yuma. You will be transported there immediately, and may God have mercy on your soul, because I have none." The gavel came down with finality, and Harold was dragged from the courtroom still shouting threats, while Hannah sagged against Nathan in overwhelming relief. Outside the courthouse, the gray clouds finally opened up with rain that washed the streets clean, and Hannah tilted her face up to the sky, feeling as if the water was washing away the last chains that had bound her to Harold. Nathan pulled her close, heedless of the people watching, and kissed her soundly right there on the courthouse steps. When they broke apart, Hannah was laughing and crying at the same time, the release of tension leaving her giddy and light-headed. "It is over," she said wonderingly. "He cannot hurt me anymore. I am really free." Nathan cupped her face in his hands and smiled down at her with love shining clear in his eyes. "You are free, and now you get to decide what you want your life to be." Hannah knew exactly what she wanted, had known it for weeks now, but had been afraid to fully acknowledge it while her past still had such a strong hold on her present. She kissed Nathan again, pouring all her hope and joy and love into the gesture, and when she pulled back, she saw her own emotions reflected in his face. They rode back to the ranch through the rain, arriving soaked but happy to find the cabin waiting for them like a promise of the future. Over the next weeks, Hannah worked with a lawyer in Clifton to file for divorce from Harold, the process made simple by his imprisonment and conviction. When the papers finally came through declaring her officially divorced, she and Nathan celebrated quietly with a dinner she cooked from the vegetables in the spring garden they had planted together. "I have something to ask you," Nathan said after they finished eating, his tone serious enough that Hannah's heart started to race. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles over her knuckles. "These past months with you have been the best of my life. You have made this house a home and given me something to look forward to every single day. I know we have not known each other that long by most people's standards, but sometimes you just know when something is right." He slid out of his chair and dropped to one knee beside her, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. "Hannah Lawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you what real love looks like, building the home and family you always wanted, and being the partner you deserve." Hannah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Yes," she said, the word coming out half laugh and half sob. "Yes, Nathan, I will marry you. I love you so much." Nathan slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that left them both breathless. "When?" he asked when they finally broke apart. Hannah smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. "Soon. I do not want to wait any longer to start our real life together." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Clifton, with Sheriff Morrison and Doc Wilson serving as witnesses. Hannah wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself and carried wildflowers from the ranch, and Nathan wore his best suit with his hair slicked back and his face clean-shaven. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan kissed her with such tenderness that Hannah felt fresh tears slip down her cheeks, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. They returned to the ranch as man and wife, and that night Nathan carried Hannah over the threshold of what was now their home together. They made love slowly and gently, Nathan taking his time to show Hannah that physical intimacy could be beautiful when it was founded on love and respect. She discovered her own passion in his arms, learned that her body could be a source of pleasure rather than pain, and fell even more deeply in love with the man who had saved her life, and then given her a reason to live it fully. The years that followed were everything Hannah had dreamed of and more. She and Nathan built their ranch into a thriving enterprise, expanding their herd and their property through hard work and careful planning. Hannah proved to have a natural talent for ranching, particularly with the horses, and she developed a reputation in the area for her skill in training the animals. She found joy in the physical labor and the satisfaction of seeing the results of her efforts, found pride in being an equal partner in their venture rather than a dependent. Their first child was born 2 years after their wedding, a healthy boy they named James after Nathan's father. Hannah had been terrified throughout the pregnancy that she would not know how to be a good mother given her own experiences, but Nathan had been patient and supportive, and Doc Wilson had guided her through the birth with gentle expertise. When she held their son for the first time and saw Nathan's face light up with wonder and love, Hannah knew she had finally found the home and family she had always wanted. James was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Rose, and then another son they called Daniel. Their cabin grew to accommodate their expanding family, with Nathan adding rooms and a proper second floor that turned the humble structure into a real house. Hannah's garden flourished under her care, providing vegetables for their table and flowers that brightened every room. She taught her children to read using the books Nathan ordered from back east, and together they taught them the skills they would need to thrive in the rugged territory. Life was not always easy in the Arizona territory during those years. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and horse thieves, the ever-present dangers of living in a place where civilization still felt tenuous. But through it all, Hannah and Nathan faced every challenge together, their love deepening with each year that passed. They learned each other's quirks and habits, developed private jokes and shared memories, built a partnership that was truly equal in every way that mattered. Hannah never forgot the darkness she had escaped, or the miracle of Nathan appearing on that creek bank at exactly the right moment. Sometimes, she would wake in the night from dreams of drowning, and Nathan would hold her close, murmuring reassurances, until her breathing steadied, and she remembered that she was safe. Those moments became less frequent as time passed, and happiness replaced trauma as her dominant reality, but they never disappeared entirely. She carried the scars of her first marriage the way one might carry a wound that had healed but left marks behind. She used her experience to help other women when she could, quietly offering assistance and refuge to those in Clifton, who found themselves trapped in situations similar to what she had endured. More than once Nathan came home to find a bruised woman at their kitchen table, drinking tea while Hannah explained options and resources. They helped several women escape bad situations over the years, and Hannah always felt like she was paying forward the kindness Nathan had shown her. Harold Lawson died in prison 12 years after his sentencing, killed in a fight with another inmate, according to the brief notice that appeared in the newspaper. Hannah felt nothing when she read the announcement, except relief that he was truly gone from the world and could never threaten her or her family again. Nathan burned the newspaper and held her while she cried, not for Harold, but for the girl she had been who had made such terrible choices out of fear and desperation. "You are not that girl anymore," Nathan told her as he wiped away her tears. "You are a strong, capable woman who built an amazing life from the ashes of that nightmare. You are an incredible mother and the best partner I could ever ask for. Whatever Harold took from you, you took back tenfold by choosing to live fully and love completely." Hannah kissed him with gratitude for his words and for the truth in them, knowing that she had indeed reclaimed her life and made it into something beautiful. Their children grew into fine young people who carried the best qualities of both parents. James inherited his father's steady nature and his mother's way with horses, eventually taking over much of the ranch work as Nathan grew older. Rose had Hannah's determination and Nathan's kind heart, becoming a teacher in Clifton and using her position to advocate for better treatment of women in the rough mining town. Daniel combined his parents' love of the land with a head for business, helping to expand the ranch's operations to include selling trained horses to the army forts that were being established throughout the territory. Hannah and Nathan celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and a growing number of grandchildren. The house filled with laughter and love in quantities that would have seemed impossible during those dark days of 1885. They stood on their porch as the sun set over the mountains, Nathan's arm around Hannah's waist and her head resting on his shoulder, surveying the life they had built together with deep satisfaction. "You remember that first night after I pulled you from the creek?" Nathan asked quietly. "When I wrapped you in blankets and held you to keep you warm." Hannah smiled and tightened her arm around his waist. "I remember thinking I had died and you were an angel. Everything was so confused and I was so cold." Nathan chuckled and pressed a kiss to her temple. "I remember being terrified you would not make it, and then being amazed by how strong you were once you decided to fight back." Hannah turned to face him, her green eyes still as bright at 48 as they had been at 23. "You gave me a reason to fight. You showed me that there was another kind of man in the world, another way of living. You saved me, Nathan Quinn, in every way that matters." Nathan cupped her face in his weathered hands and kissed her with all the love and devotion of their quarter-century together. "We saved each other," he said firmly. "I was existing before you, just going through the motions. You taught me what it meant to truly live and love and build something meaningful with another person." They stood together as darkness fell, and the stars came out one by one. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a love story for the ages. The ranch spread out around them in quiet testimony to their hard work and dedication, the house behind them filled with the legacy of their love. Hannah thought about the girl who had been thrown into a frozen creek and left to die, and felt profound gratitude for the cowboy who had pulled her out and kept her warm in every way possible. Their later years were peaceful, filled with the satisfaction of watching their children thrive and their grandchildren grow. Nathan and Hannah remained active on the ranch well into their 60s, still working alongside their children and still deeply in love after decades of marriage. They took walks together in the evening, reminiscing about their life and making plans for whatever time they had left. They celebrated the arrival of each new grandchild with joy and watched with pride as their family continued to expand. Hannah never took for granted the miracle of her second chance at life and love. She woke each morning grateful for Nathan's presence beside her, for the home they had built, for the children they had raised, for every ordinary moment of the extraordinary life they shared. She had learned that true love was not about grand gestures or passionate declarations, but about choosing each other every day, supporting each other through hardships, celebrating each other's victories, and building something lasting through commitment and care. Nathan felt the same gratitude, often thanking Providence for leading him down that particular trail on that particular January day in 1885. He had saved Hannah's life in the physical sense, but she had saved his in ways that went far deeper. She had given him purpose and partnership, had filled his house with warmth and his days with meaning, had loved him with a fierce devotion that never wavered even in their hardest times. He considered himself the luckiest man in Arizona territory and never tired of telling her so. They passed into their 70s together, eventually stepping back from active ranch work and letting their children run the operations while they enjoyed their golden years. They spent their days in quiet companionship, reading together by the fire, tending Hannah's flower garden, playing with their grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the house with noise and laughter. Their love had aged like fine wine, growing richer and more complex with each passing year, seasoned by shared experiences and tempered by mutual respect. Nathan passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, leaving Hannah heartbroken, but also profoundly grateful for the 53 years they had shared. She lived another 5 years after his death, surrounded by the family they had created together, and supported by children who had learned from their parents' example what a good marriage looked like. She spoke often of Nathan during those final years, telling stories to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who gathered around her chair, ensuring that his memory and his goodness would live on through generations. When Hannah finally passed away at 84, she was laid to rest beside Nathan in the small cemetery outside Clifton, their headstones standing side by side overlooking the ranch they had built together. The inscription on Hannah's stone read, "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, who turned tragedy into triumph and built a legacy of love." Nathan's stone bore similar sentiments, but it was the final line that captured the essence of their story. He saved her life, and she gave him reason to live it fully. Their descendants continued to work the ranch for generations after, each one carrying forward the values of hard work, integrity, and devotion that Nathan and Hannah had modeled. The story of how their great-great-grandparents met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments hope can appear in unexpected forms. The ranch itself stood as testament to what could be built when two people committed fully to each other and to creating something meaningful together. In the end, Hannah and Nathan's story was one of redemption and second chances, of finding love when all hope seemed lost, of building beauty from ashes. It was a story of a cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time and chose to act with courage and compassion, and of a woman who survived the unsurvivable and went on to thrive beyond her wildest dreams. It was a story of the Wild West in all its harshness and possibility, a time when life could be brutal but also beautiful, when justice sometimes prevailed, and love could conquer even the coldest creek and the darkest night. Their love had started with Nathan pulling Hannah from freezing water and keeping her warm, but it had grown into something that warmed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. It proved that true love was not about dramatic rescues alone, but about the daily choice to cherish and support each other, to build together rather than tear apart, to see partnership as a source of strength rather than a tool of control. Their story became a beacon for their family and community, a reminder of what was possible when people chose kindness over cruelty, love over fear, and hope over despair. The ranch that Nathan and Hannah built together still stood well into the 20th century, a sprawling operation that bore their names on the faded sign at the gate. Visitors who came there in later years could still see the original cabin that Nathan had carried Hannah into that cold January day, preserved as the heart of the larger house that had grown around it. They could walk the banks of Mineral Creek, where Hannah had nearly died and Nathan had saved her, could stand on the porch where the couple had spent countless evenings watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. But more than the physical legacy, Nathan and Hannah left behind a story that inspired and instructed, that showed how one act of courage could change not just two lives, but generations of lives that followed. They had proven that it was never too late to start over, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings led to the most beautiful endings. Their story was one of survival and triumph, of finding home in another person rather than just a place, of building something lasting from the broken pieces of a shattered past. And so the tale of the cowboy who pulled a beaten woman from a frozen creek and kept her warm became more than just a story about rescue. It became a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of choosing compassion over indifference, and the remarkable things that could happen when two people decided to face life together rather than alone. It was a story of the Old West in all its complexity, harsh and beautiful, dangerous and full of possibility. A time when a single moment of courage could change the course of a life, and when true love, though rare, was worth fighting for with everything you had. Hannah and Nathan's legacy lived on not just in the ranch and the family they created, but in the example they set for how to love well and live fully, how to turn tragedy into triumph, how to build something beautiful from the ashes of devastation. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that hope could be found even in the darkest moments, that second chances did exist for those brave enough to seize them, and that sometimes the greatest love stories began not with passionate declarations, but with simple acts of human decency and compassion. They had shown that being truly warm had nothing to do with physical temperature, and everything to do with being held by someone who valued you, protected you, and chose you every single day. And in doing so, they created a love story that would warm hearts for generations to come.